Hello to all, welcome back. Today's video will be about Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, our second book. The video will get a little bit lengthy this time. I think this one might run a while. It'll be separated into 3 parts, so I'll announce those sections, so you may want to watch this in parts. The first part will be about the new assignments, just sort of walking you through what's expected with this new book. And then I want to walk you through the slideshow. I have a long slideshow here that I want to talk through with you. And the first half of the slideshow is about the book proper, and the second half is about the criticism of the book or the reviews. And so you can think about this in like 3 segments. That might be helpful. Okay, so first off, some basics about what's happening. So I sent this announcement out. I'll get those Alexi essays graded real soon. Thank you for getting those in on time. And there are lots of new assignments posted, or 3, I shouldn't say lots. And then here's the video as promised. So if you take a look here, we're now into the segment of the course where we are talking, we're going 2 weeks at a time. So we'll take 2 weeks on Maggie, 2 weeks on the following 3 novels. So we have just a discussion question due midnight on this Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, and then next week we'll have a discussion question and the review due on that Sunday. So you should spend your time this week really reading well, not only the book, but also this reviews and criticism, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the following week you'll need to work on the discussion question and the review essay. Okay, so let me jump right in on what those are then. The discussion questions. So here's the first one right here. That's this week, and then next week will be number 3. So this one is just 2 paragraphs, and let me check my share screen here a minute. I want to make sure we're on the right place here. Yeah, that's working. Okay. So now, yep, here we go. This is more just like a reading question about when you're partway through the book, chapter 5, it's about Maggie and Pete. It's just has to do with Maggie and Pete meeting, and I'd like to know what you think and sort of speculate about, if you were Maggie's friend, what would you say to her about her first impressions of Pete? And because those are pretty significant, and it'd be like that advice kind of thing that you give to a girlfriend or to a friend, and you say, you know, when she's considering dating this new guy, what would you say to her? And then, despite what you think, right, or what you'd say, why do you think she ends up going out with him anyway? Or, you know, what's going on there? And then do respond, because I think these will be kind of fun, actually. You know, relationship advice is always fun. And when we're giving advice about relationships to fictional characters, so go ahead and respond once at least to a Pierce post. Okay, so then next week, Wednesday, these are going to sound pretty complicated, but this will get you ready for your review essay, which is that's exactly what the subject is about. We're going to talk about Christians and their obligation to help the poor, and how that presents itself in Maggie. So there's 2 things here, a couple of thought questions, and then some questions that require you to dig up some evidence out of the book. And I don't expect you to summarize these in a lengthy fashion, just a very brief note when you see one of these things occurring with the page number. And this will be really helpful, not only for you as you put your essay together, but for your peers, and your peers will benefit from your notes too, so that we all have a lot of evidence to go on. All right, so those are the 2 discussion questions for the next 2 weeks. And then under content, I have the new review essay. So here's Alexi, Here's the new review essay. It's very similar. Remember, these are going to be really similar every time. And when I go through your Alexi essays, I will make reference to these things. And when I'm taking off points, so that you can get a sense of why the points are coming off, and address those things in subsequent assignments. Okay, so this time around, and again, if you haven't read the book or haven't even gotten started, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense, and that's fine. Don't let it bother you. This is just a you know, a heads up on what's coming, right? So as you read. Anyway, it's the same length, and oh, and there's a sample here. I'll get to that in a second. How does Crane characterize the activities of Christians in Maggie, a Girl of the Streets? Spend some time summarizing those moments when ministers or church people appear. What do they do and what do they say? Note and summarize other biblical references and echoes. Given that Crane was raised in a prominent Methodist family, what do you think Crane's book suggests about the Christian responsibility to help the poor? Okay, so there's kind of a lot packed into that, but I'll help you with that as we move along today through the slides. And you'll see quite a bit of information about this in those slides as well. Okay, so as I said, with this Alexi essay, I gave you a paper with annotations that I annotated for you, so you knew what I thought of the paper. Excuse me. This time around, I have an example essay, but I don't have it annotated. So let me pull it up here for you. Here's a sample essay from a student a few years ago and about the very same topic. And I didn't annotate it, but I think you'll get a lot out of this, seeing how the student put the essay together, how they used the evidence, how they developed their thesis. And again, this is quite a good paper. I don't know that it's a straight A, but it's certainly it's that kind of high B level writing that I like you to see, where they're doing a really good job of covering the basics of the assignment. Even if it's not, you know, out of the park home run, it's a good example of how to respond to this prompt. So that is there for your use if you wish. Okay, back to this. So that's due, like I said, on the 30th. So that's a while away. All right, back to content. Just a second here. Okay. Under the Maggie folder, we have two things. Just a second. Okay, let's take a look at the Maggie folder. That's here. So the first thing I want to show you is this assignment here. I attached a PDF copy of the supplementary reading. So if you weren't able to get a hold of this one, remember the Norton Critical Edition that I talked about? There are all kinds of editions of Maggie out there, and probably you can find them online too, full text. But if you didn't get a hold of this, I just made a PDF out of this material. So if you do have the Norton Critical Edition, right, then I put the page numbers of what you need right here. So And don't be alarmed, it's not a lot. Most of these are just a couple of pages, and sometimes they're just a paragraph long. They're very brief readings. Because when you look at this, and when you look at the old Norton, you're gonna, like I said the other day, I think it's like 300 pages of extra material, and we're not reading anywhere near all of it. We're just reading a few short samples to get a sense of what's there. And so if you've got the Norton Critical, you just follow along here, and it's easy enough. I've got the title and the author, and if there is an author, and then the page numbers there. But if you do need it, and weren't able to get a hold of it, gotta switch my share screen here, I think. Well, it looks like that one actually popped up for you. So, okay. So hope you can see this. Should be able to. This is what it looks like. It's just a photocopy in a PDF for you. And here's the table of contents. So simple as that. It's kind of a crummy old PDF, but you can read it at least. So, and the thing is, I should alert you. So most of these are contemporary with the publication of Maggie. So this material, in other words, is contemporary or close to when Crane's book came out, and that's, 1896 or 93, depending on the edition. And so it's dated, right? So this isn't the easiest reading. Some of the vocab might be a little unusual to you. All right, so that PDF is there. That you need to know. Okay. Secondly, I have a slideshow here, PowerPoint. And as I noted here, the questions aren't homework. And there's just a load of, kind of like with Lexi, there's a load of information here. And you're not expected to answer these questions, just the ones in the discussion. And what I've got here is a long slideshow, and the first half is about the book proper, and the second half is about the reviews. So as I said about this video, right? So I'm talking about assignments now and what's happening in the next 2 weeks. And I'm going to shift into talking about the book here in the second part. And in the third part of the video, I'm going to talk about this. So you think about the week. We've got 2 discussion questions to write. We've got a review essay to write. But what's really happening is that we have this novel, we have this new novel in front of us, and then we have a set of reviews, criticism, and background and sources about the book. And these will be really helpful as you put your review essays together, right? Because that question, and on the surface of it, that might sound like something, hey, I think I can write about that or have something to say about it already. You need to know a lot. I mean, you need to know some things about this book. Well, let's get started. Let me pull up the slideshow. Okay, so slideshow, and so this is the let's call it. This is the second third. The next part of the video. So if you want to take a break now, this would be a good time to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to launch in with a long conversation with you about the slides. Okay, so there's that. And just a minute here. Okay, let's get into this book. Let's get into this book via my slides here, and I'll say a lot more things than just what's on the slides, but the slides will be a bit of a guide for you to just keep track of my remarks. Okay, should be able to see that screen now. Okay, here we go. Oh yeah, all the characters, right? That's an important thing. And then the setting, and then the plot. All right, let's go back. So here's the thing. This was published in 1893, so this is a much older novel than anything else that we have with our class this term. And so it's the turn of the 20th century. And the other interesting thing is that Crane had to publish it himself, so it wasn't technically published in it until 1896. And as I mentioned, you know, it's a short little thing. I mean, my edition just runs 88 pages or so, so it's really more of a novella, we'd call it, than a novel, because it's so brief. And that's nice, right, to have a short reading. But the thing is, right, if you've cracked into it at all, it's not an easy read. At least the first time through, I found it a bit of a challenge, namely because of the dialect, right? Crane is attempting to reconstruct visually with text an oral, right, speech. And we don't see that in novels very often anymore, in fiction, because it's extremely difficult to do that and not patronize your characters. Anything that doesn't sound like standard English makes folks not sound like standard English speakers. And often that sounds patronizing. And so there's a whole long history to this, and I won't get into it, but one of the masters of dialect in English, in American English anyway, is Mark Twain. You probably know Sam Clemens' work. I hope you do anyway. And his attempt to capture numerous dialects from the Mid-South and Deep South and the West. He traveled west too, and he was one of the most successful at it. So anyway, that makes this little book a little bit hard to read. And there are footnotes in the Norton Critical Edition, which might help you understand some of the dialect, some of the terms. But like the old days when we were younger, just sound it out and try to make sense of what the characters are saying. If you were going to adapt this to the screen, right, that would be cool. What you would need would be somebody like, I don't know if you know Daniel Day-Lewis's work, but he's a terrific actor. And I do believe, is he Irish by birth? He might be. But what we need really is some great Irish actors, because most of this, you know, the Johnsons, even though their name is Johnson, which is more like a Scandinavian name, Crane's sort of impression of these folks are as Irish, fairly recent immigrants. Now, none of that is really evident in the way Crane writes. I mean, he doesn't talk about them being Irish. He doesn't contextualize that way. He just drops us right in to the dialogue and the scene, and we need to figure it out on our own. But indeed, if you kind of imagine one of your favorite Irish actors doing the voices, then I think that'll get you a long ways. Somebody like Cole Meany or Brendan Gleeson, he would be great. Anyway, we have the old Johnsons raising hell, and so as I said, yeah, the family name's Johnson. We don't ever get a name for the father. He's just the father, and he doesn't last very many chapters. And the curious thing, right, I'm asking here about how Crane describes people, and there's an old woman who lives in the apartment building, or let's call it a tenement house, because that's what it is. It's not really an apartment building. It's called a tenement. and these were notorious structures in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And yeah, there's this old woman who lives, she's a neighbor to the Johnsons. And then we learn a lot about Jimmy and then Pete and Maggie. And here's that question for your first discussion question, right, about Pete and Maggie meeting. So yeah, so we got little Jimmy, and he's fighting right at the beginning. Remember that? And his dad drags him home, and we meet Tommy, the little toddler baby, and then Maggie, little sister. And it is curious how Crane describes people. As I was saying, he doesn't give us much context. He just drops us down into the story. And by the same token, the characters aren't, I don't know, we usually talk about it like fleshing out characters, right? And you get to know them a little bit, but this is different. It's a different kind of fiction writing, of prose style, and there's good reason for it, and we'll delve into that in a little while. But just wanted you to note the characters are treated differently by Crane than we typically predominantly see by fiction writers. And in the same way, how he describes the setting is a little different than ordinary. And my questions just try to remind you and help you visualize and see, and don't just let the prose go by, right? It's like, try to visualize and then try to pay attention to how Crane is doing it. Because that's really one of the things, you know, a college level lit course where, okay, I'm getting the story, right? We talked about this, got characters and plot, right? But there's a level of understanding that comes from like paying attention to how things are written that's a little deeper than just what, if you know what I mean, right? So what happens, okay, there's a plot, there's people, you know, but when you start to pay attention to how the writer is constructing the story, it becomes even more interesting, right? So we've got those first, you know, things about character and about what's happening, which for the, you know, the opening, well, I've got a question about plot here, but in the opening scene, we got the fight, we go home, we have a meal of sorts. I don't know if you describe that as a meal, it was meal time. But then we have, you know, the way he's telling the story. So yeah, and keep in mind, I just put horse-drawn there because it's the 1890s, right? So Model T, you know, the rudimentary automobiles are, you know, some early, there would be some, you know, early adopters, but for the most part, these are horse-drawn carriage and, you know, stifling, congested. It's the Lower East Side. I don't know if you know Manhattan well at all, Manhattan Island, but this is the Lower East Side. So, you know, the Brooklyn Bridge, well, Brooklyn Bridge is actually a little further south than where we are. This is called the Bowery. And the bridge didn't go up until, let's see, 1889, I believe, if I remember right. So these are the, let's just call it the swarming tenement houses of Irish and other immigrants, right? So poor, packed tight, the Bowery. There have been books and movies done about this for years and years. Maybe I mentioned Daniel Day-Lewis because there was a film called Gangs of New York. It's real rough and violent, but if you want a taste of the Bowery, that was actually set in what's called 5 Points, where 5 streets came together. That movie, but it's about a movie by Martin Scorsese, and Daniel Day-Lewis and Brendan Gleeson. You know, it's just a really good visual if you want to take a couple hours to find the gangs of New York, and you'll hear how they speak. But it really focuses on the violence of the gangs and multi-generational, you know, blood feuds. But Crane really focuses more on the domestic. You know, this is a domestic tale, a family story, if you will, even though that might come as a surprise to you, given how it's written. But anyway, it's a pretty rough, you know, these are the tough streets, right? The before electrification and a lot of the modern conveniences. So, and we could call it a slum. That's a pretty pejorative term, or it's come to be pejorative, but that's certainly what's going on here. Ghetto, words like that. But wrong side of the track. I mean, we have so many expressions for this kind of thing, don't we? And many of them are pejorative, and we want to be careful with our language, right? Because we want to recognize that it isn't necessarily by choice. These characters find themselves in these conditions, especially, you know, like Tommy and Maggie, well, all of them. Right, so it's a gritty story, but it isn't, and the grit is there, but it seems like Crane is after something other than just a documentary of what it's like. I mean, certainly there's a documentary feel to this, but anyway, let's keep going. Backwards, sorry. Okay. Yeah. One of the things about the book, though, is it's episodic, and there are just a handful of chapters. I think total of, let's say, 88 pages, or 13 chapters, something like that. And each chapter, though, is a sort of miniature little portrait. So to help you understand, you know, what you're looking at, it might be good to just sort of think about it as you're probably reading slow because of the dialect, and get to the end of it, it's like, okay, what just happened in that chapter? Just a little episode, and then the next episode, and then the next episode. And it really, you know, it could be a TV show, like one installment. It really works that way, chapter by chapter. Okay, so here's another couple of thoughts about that prose style that I was getting at, right? So we're looking at the what, but now what about the how? I mentioned a bit about the dialects, and just curious, you know, for you to think about the impact it had on your reading. Because I guess back to that point I was making, did you feel a sense of superiority to these characters because they don't use standard English? Because that's the question behind, like, the politics of using dialect, right? We don't use it because we perceive ourselves then as speakers of standard English to be superior to the characters. And that is certainly not what Crane is after here. But he also wants to be realistic. That's certainly what he's after. He wants to show us what it's like. So he makes the choice to try to represent the dialect. Anyhow, there are scenes like the little boys fighting at the very beginning, the living conditions in the tenement house. We see those numerous times. The Johnson family dinner, or dinners, there's a couple of those. Just, wow, that is, yeah, that first one where Jimmy retreats to the old woman, you know, downstairs in the tenement when Maggie breaks a plate. And then he comes back later on and their mother is asleep, and it's just so gruesome. And then little Tommy dies. And then Jimmy attends that missions. Well, he doesn't really attend it. That's not the right way to say it. He sort of overhears a mission church service. And then there's a whole longer, like half a chapter of Jimmy driving truck, you know, his horse, you know, trying to get through the traffic, and the violence of it. And then the father dies, Maggie goes to work, and then Pete comes into the frame. He comes into their lives. So now let me jump down to the last one there. How is Crane's story making you feel about this community? I think that's a good place to start, right? Like sort of viscerally, gut level. How do you feel about this? You know, I'm being really careful here not to characterize things in a certain way, because I could lead you to certain interpretations, but I'm trying to be guarded in my descriptions right now, and just let the book speak for itself, right? And let you let you experience it. But certainly there are word choices and metaphors, right? And a sentence structure and tone, and the genre of the book itself that all lead us to feel and understand these characters in a particular way, given how Crane is writing. All right, so it's a series of questions, and I run these largely chronologically, or chapter by chapter here, so it's pretty easy to see what's what here. Hang on a second. Okay, so chapter by chapter then, let's look at this. How does he describe the dinner table and their domestic life? How is Jimmy affected by the church service? Why is Maggie attracted to Pete? What kind of guy is Pete? How does he see the world? Why does Jimmy tell Maggie she must go to work? Where does Maggie work? What are the conditions like? What's going on at the start of chapter 9? And that's one of those moments. So the other thing I should say is, given the episodic nature of the chapters, sometimes Crane it's a little bit confusing. He's just going to start you out with something new. And it's like, wait a minute, what is even happening here? As there was something going on, and then he drops you down in a new scene because, okay, chapter 9 begins, a group of urchins. Well, let me go back to the end of chapter 8. This is one of Maggie and Pete's dates, right? They go on some dates. They essentially go to bars, but they're more than bars. They're like pool halls or burlesque theater and like shows. So they were characteristic of the late 19th century, big cities, especially in New York, where, there'd be dancing and dancers on stage and big, lots of beer, lots of alcohol flowing. And anyway, she's thinking about that date. And then that ends chapter 8, and boom, chapter 9. A group of urchins were intent upon the side door of a saloon. Expectancy gleamed from their eyes. They were twisting their fingers in excitement. Here she comes, yelled one of them suddenly. It's like, what? Where are we? Who is Doc? And Crane's going to do that to you. He's going to do that to you at a couple of several different moments, and just roll with it, right? Just keep reading, and eventually you'll come to see, it's like, oh, I see who that is and what's going on. And sometimes it's almost deliberately deceiving, but he's doing it for a purpose. So be aware of that. And then we've got Mother Mary. We don't hear her name very often, but her name is Mary, and Mary Johnson. And she reacts, of course, in an explosive way to Maggie and Pete going out. And then I want you to keep track of this old neighbor woman too, because she's interestingly a pretty important character. She's not present so much, but she has a couple of important roles. So keep track of her. And also, that packed, tight tenement house, people living on top of each other's thin walls. And so the neighbors are very close. And Crane repeatedly refers to the presence of the neighbors and their response to, the Johnson family. Oh, and then just a little thing, but it's actually pretty interesting. Maybe you noticed, in fact, just how often Crane resorts to color. Not resorts to, that's the wrong way to say it. Just uses colorful vocabulary. No, that's not right either. is the use of color. Count up the number of times he uses red or green. It's startling. And then I wanted you to think about imagery and other metaphors. And I'll just give you a hint or an example. How often does Crane use animalistic or animal traits and characteristics to describe the people? And that's a very rich one. He uses that a great deal. Just take a look at that chapter when he and Pete have the fight. Remember the bar fight? How many times they're referred to as animals or particular characteristics of particular animals. All right. So that's mostly about the first, 8 or 10 chapters. We'll get further into the book in a minute, but let me say a few things about Stephen Crane. I think part of the class and part of the joy of reading literature is not only the story, but also the context. And that's why our course is called Literary Contexts. It's not just about the singular works of art, while they are important and can be studied quite fruitfully from just a perspective of themselves, standing alone out of context. But I think it's a more important conversation to say, what was going on in the world when it was written, and what, given our world or all the readership between 1893 and now, what would they have seen in the book, right? So the book comes from a certain place, and depending on where it's received, it's a different thing. Context affects it greatly, and I think that's worth paying attention to. So let's go back to 93, and he used a pseudonym. He used Johnston Smith, mostly because, well, 2 reasons: he was so young, and secondly, his family was not exactly too keen on the content. So you may know him because he's a very famous writer of short stories, but by far his fame comes from a book called The Red Badge of Courage from 1895. It's often taught. You may have read it in high school. It's a common book for late adolescents or college students. It was incredibly popular right from the start because the Civil War had ended just 3 decades previous in 1965, and there was just enough time elapsed that people were ready to read about it again. Enough time had passed. And the predominant Civil War narrative at the time was quite dry and laden with jargon and statistics and sort of dispassionate storytelling, if you will. And Red Badge, and you can see it in Maggie, the use of dialogue, the use of startling imagery. It made the war so visceral and so real, for lack of a better word. And because Crane, in some ways, it's ironic, right? But in some ways, because he didn't fight, he was far too young, he wasn't born. It's curious, right? Because you can have veterans and people who go through traumatic experiences themselves do a fine job writing, but sometimes the experience itself, the real experience itself, actually hampers the ability to tell the story in a way that helps others who weren't there visualize it. It kind of depends, but Crane was one of those. Just the talent with the words, he made it. I don't want to say real. I know you probably think, well, are you looking for the word real? No, because it's not exactly realism. It's something else. It's an aesthetic experience, in the mind via language that I'm going to use a word visceral that I've used a couple of times to describe Maggie, because it really is, at its core, not so realistic as it is expressionistic. I'm going to use a term from the visual arts. It made him famous. It sold like crazy. People loved it. And so then he was able to get Maggie published in '96 or republished, because he self-published the thing. He couldn't find a publisher and nobody would touch it. So he just paid for it to be published, a handful of copies, a couple hundred. And if you ever run across one of these in a used bookstore somewhere in the world and it's cheap, you buy it, because it's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, because these are so rare. Anyway, but what they did in '96 was expurgate. I mean, they took out anything that sounded too controversial for the taste of the day. And you can actually see that if you have the Norton edition. In the footnotes, they're going to have all the things that were expurgated, that were taken out, were censored. And in some cases, those are really significant. And if you happen to grab a used paperback, a cheap paperback online, you might actually be missing some really key scenes. Well, I should say that. You'll be missing a lot of cuss words and some cursing in the dialect, and one key scene when the grotesque figure follows the girl of the Crimson Legions down to the river. I don't know if you've read that already, but that whole paragraph is gone from the '96 edition. Anyway, they've restored it. Because the thing is, society and publishing and mores have changed, right? So all of this cursing and blood and fighting and vicious drunken behavior on the part of Mary and the boys, and that just wasn't, no one would touch that as a publisher. I mean, especially not coming from an unknown author. So this was really edgy material back in the day, and in some sense it still is. I mean, I know it sounds dated and probably numbed by so much violence in TV and movies, but this is a pretty brutal book when you think about what actually happens. Prostitution, alcoholism, family, domestic abuse, violence. It's a tough thing. Anyway, let me just say a little bit more here, because Crane was, believe it or not, in his 20s. He was 22 when he wrote this, so he was a wonder kid. He was an incredibly talented writer, almost not from birth, but he grew up in New Jersey, and I don't know what your impression is of Asbury Park and the coast there along the Jersey Shore, because it's quite depressed economically now. He actually hails from the same regions as Bruce Springsteen. I don't know if you know that artist, that singer. He was a really popular rock and roll singer in the '80s. Anyway, but back in the day, it was not economically depressed in the late, excuse me, late 19th century. I'm going to pause a second. Okay, as I was saying about Crane's biography, here we go. Coastal New Jersey in the late 19th century was for the middle class, the fairly well off. It was a nice community, and many New Yorkers, wealthy New Yorkers, had vacation homes there, and to some extent that still exists, at least further south. If you've ever been to Cape May, it's a lovely sandy beach resort on the southern tip of New Jersey. But back in the day, it was a middle class area. So I don't want you to get the impression that Crane grew up like this. He did not grow up impoverished in New York, in the Bowery, or suffer any of these kinds of things in the tenement housing. He was one of, I think it was 14 kids. It's a lot. It might not be quite 14, but big family. And Jonathan Townley Crane, his father, was a really big deal. He was a Methodist minister, and he had a big church, and he also was quite successful in distributing his sermons beyond his church. So he was a good writer. He was a good speaker. He was and important too, not just some minister at some Methodist church in New Jersey, but someone who held leadership positions in the denomination. And Methodism is a very large Christian denomination, has been for many years, and was especially so in the late 19th century. And Crane's mother, too, was from a very prominent Methodist family. So I want you to imagine a relatively well-off, middle-class kid, one of the younger, he may have been the youngest, one of the younger of this big family, important, very Christian, very, and very much in the leadership of the church, the Methodist church. And if you don't know, maybe, I've run into plenty of Methodists at Northwestern. Maybe some of you are from that background. I don't know what your experience has been in the 21st century, but back in the day, the Methodist church really, its identity was really rooted in helping. There's all kinds of different kinds of Christians, right? And all sorts of different emphases within the faith, right? Some denominations, some groups of Christians are not denominational at all. That's a very common expression of Christianity these days, to have just a community church and not a sense of historicity or a big organization or some apparatus, but just locally organized. Congregationalist movement is that. And others, evangelical free, non-denominational, there's just all kinds of ways. But my point is that historically, you can find churches that really emphasize the cross, right? Jesus' sacrifice. That's the pinnacle, the point. You can find other churches that really emphasize the incarnation of Christ as one of us. You can find other Christian traditions that really emphasize the theology, right? The theological principles that are developed through close readings of the Bible. And other groups of churches that focus just on the Bible as sufficient, not so much the historical Christ, his incarnation, or his sacrifice, or the theology from the Bible, but the Bible itself. And there are lots of others. I'm making big generalizations, but they're helpful, I think. It's helpful for self-reflection and your own church background, your own Christian identity. And I'm really just talking more along the post-Protestant Reformation, because of course we have the church from the beginning into the Roman Catholic and then Eastern Orthodox traditions persisting. It's alive and well. So it's interesting. And I don't want to go off on too much on the side here, but just want to encourage you to think, given your traditions, what would you say, the emphases within your background? Anyway, for Methodists, it was service. And we see this in all Christians, but especially in Methodism. It's really about serving people. It's about helping people. We're not so pietistic necessarily, like right action. We're not so theological. We're not so consumed with the biblical text. We're not so focused on the resurrection or the incarnation. We're focused on helping other people. And so when you look around the United States, you'll see often, hospitals and orphanages and other social organizations that are there to serve, often underwritten or founded or established by Methodists. So these are Crane's people. But let's keep in mind that Crane's in his 20s when he writes this. So he's not his father. He's not a seasoned old man. He's a young kid. And he was bright, and he was a gifted writer, to be sure. But like a lot of 20-year-old somethings, he was he was adventurous. He was very adventurous. So he loved baseball. I don't know that that's important, but he loved baseball, and that's why he went to college. He went to Syracuse University. It still exists for a while, just to play ball. Did not study well, did not do well. He dropped out, transferred, tried to, but college just wasn't his thing. He really went to work as a newspaperman, just, journalist in hometown newspapers in Jersey. And then he had I don't know, restless spirit. He was really, I think, adventurous. So I'll stick to that word. And he loved New York, right? And he's close by, right? And one of his favorite places to go, as you might have guessed, were these places in the Lower East Side, in the Bowery especially, where it was just like a world apart from the clean, nice, tidy, well-behaved citizens of the small New Jersey towns where he grew up. These teeming streets full of, well, what he describes with Jimmy driving his truck, and the poverty and the prostitution and the pool halls and the bars, and just you kind of start to imagine it as you read. And now I want you to imagine it through the eyes of some 20-something college dropout who loves to write and loves to experience all of these, this life, I guess, for lack of a better word. Okay? So just let that settle in a little bit, just knowing that little bit of background about Crane. Now, the other thing you should know, too, is that because of who they were, he didn't just visit the Bowery as a 20-something for adventure. He had already been to places like this with his family and his church, right? See how this fits together? They'd gone on, what we would call service projects, right? So the family, Jonathan, and the kids, and actually Jonathan dies when Crane is quite young. So these are earlier childhood formative experiences where they go into the city, into the Bowery, and work at a soup kitchen or some equivalent, or maybe do a service, right? A mission church type of service. So I don't want to get too involved in Crane's biography, but I think it's really valuable for you to know those things. The importance of his Christian Methodist background and what Methodism is about, and the fact that those were the first experiences he had in the Bowery. And then as 20-something, wanted to go back. And given that he's a writer and he sees things as an artist and writer, so he's a journalist first, right? He does the news stories, but clearly his eye was towards something more artistic, something more of a personal nature, artistic anyway, than just the journalist recording the facts. Okay. Right, so now a few more sort of review questions about the chapters. Oh, I mentioned this already, about the animals and the fight at Pete's bar, about the old neighbor. This is the same old neighbor woman, remember? In that first chapter, Jimmy goes down for safekeeping, or, because Maggie's being beaten up because she broke the plate. Whoops. then the old Namer woman tells Jimmy something about Pete and Maggie. Of course, Mary and Jimmy buy the story hook, line, and sinker, even though, you know, the neighbor lady is gossiping. Because it's so curious, right? This, and I don't know how, how you interpreted it at first, but Mag's gone to the devil. Mag's gone to the devil, this whole refrain. I think, well, what did she do? And there's no evidence about her and Pete having sexual relations, just that he's been taking her out. So it's curious. I mean, you can assume that they did or didn't, and I don't know that becomes a piece of evidence that's even meaningful. But anyway, they believe that she's gone to the devil, and so they react in this volatile way. And Jimmy goes to beat up Pete, and then they go to this other dance hall. So there's like a series of 3 dance halls where they go. Burlesque, these bars that I talked about. And their relationship changes. And then Maggie and Mary have this, chapter 13 now, have this conversation about what they think they should do. And it's very strange because they're trying to have some sense of like what's right, but they don't even seem to understand what's right in order to base their decision on. So, and then Nellie shows up. Maggie realizes something about Pete's relationship to her. It's a sad story, and it's really tragic. She, you know, the poor girl is destined to end badly. And then there's this chapter 15. This is one of those chapters where it might be a little confusing because Crane just starts you off with a woman walking down the street. And it's not Maggie, it's Hattie. And it's the first time we've met her. But it turns out that she's one of Jimmy's girlfriends who he's gotten pregnant. So, I mean, talk about irony, right? So Jimmy and his mom are condemning Maggie for going out with Pete, and Jimmy's got a girl pregnant and a child, and probably others, because the narrator says something to that effect, but Jimmy's willing to condemn his own sister for things he's done. So this hypocrisy and double standard, it's all over the place. And then Maggie confronts Pete and says, you know, where am I supposed to go? And Pete tells her to go to hell. And Jimmy and his mother have already condemned their sister and daughter to hell, and that's, you know, how they talk. But in some more literal way, that's where she's gone. And then then this chapter where again a woman is walking down the street. It's not Hattie and it's not Maggie, although maybe it is Maggie, because that's sort of the implication, but she's never named, right? So this is classic Crane, where characters are unnamed because I don't know what you think. I mean, it's partly, I think, like Maggie could be anybody, or not anybody, but so many girls like Maggie. She's a Maggie, right? Which is really contemporary, given the horrific nature of human trafficking these days in the 21st century. I mean, Maggie's story is really, I think, really powerful still today. It's like this happens, it's happening every day. She's thrown out by her family because she's deemed impure and compromised and ruined or whatever. They have no evidence for this. And her boyfriend dumps her because he's just been using her anyway. And he has aspirations for someone better like Nellie. And what's she to do? I mean, she already lives in a tenement. There's no jobs, there's no employment. So prostitution is the only avenue. And so by, you know, the time difference between these chapters is long as a few months, but her descent, if you will. And then that chapter is a kind of descent too, because remember, this is the woman, she's in the bright lit theater district in this really nice part of New York, and then she goes street to street further down into the seedier parts of town. And this is that chapter that ends with that great, enormous, beast-like, greasy figure with the, dribbling from his beard and his grotesque belly jiggling. And then there's a kind of silent river. And the implication, well, I don't know, people read it different ways. I mean, one implication is that it's a suicide, right? She steps into the river and drowns herself, or this beast of a figure, murders her or something like that. But yeah, it's a tough story. And then we see, Pete with Nellie, and Nellie rejects him. He's like dead drunk, and then Jimmy comes home to announce that Mag's dead. And then the mother throws this fit, and there's this strange sort of twist on forgiveness where this woman in black, she's a new character who shows up in the last chapter. Anyway, in the last chapter, a woman in black shows up, and she's presumably there to grieve with Mary Johnson over the loss of Maggie. In a strange sort of like, she encourages Mary to forgive her, but like a lot of the book, it's talk that comes from the church. It comes from Christianity, but it's twisted where, the mother forgives the daughter for some perceived wrong. And if you read that chapter a couple times, you'll see that Crane attributes to the woman in black talk that she heard from the mission churches. It's another moment where, it seems like Crane has something to say about the attempt on the part of Christians to help the poor, and then the result. And given his biography and what he experienced, growing up the way he did, and then his writing as a journalist covering stories that occur in places like the Bowery, and then his fascination with it, you take those things all together, and you get a little novel, I think, that is a young artist who was raised in a Christian home, trying to understand the impact of his father's and his family's ministry on people he cares about. Now, care about is maybe not quite right. I've been talking about it as fascinated with his adventure led him to the Bowery, or a sense for adventure. But there's a famous story about him appearing in court to defend a prostitute. And there's good evidence that he had like a long-term relationship with a woman who'd been a prostitute. So I hope that helps you think about, like, encapsulates the book. 20-something, brilliant, artistic writer raised in a really important Christian family, witnessing how the Christian message to the poor has gotten all out of whack and twisted. That's a takeaway. Something to think about too. I think a really important question that will lead you to a lot of ways to meditate on the meaning of the book is this: who or what is to blame for Maggie's death? And there's so many ways to answer that well. Blame Jimmy, blame the Bowery, blame her father and mother, blame alcohol, blame the old woman downstairs, blame Pete, blame herself. It's sort of endlessly interesting. So think about that. All right, so this is the end of part 2. Okay, so if you want to take a break, that's fine. I'm going to talk now about the background and context readings there. And yeah, like I said, like I've always been saying throughout here, if you want me to clarify any points or say anything more, I'm happy to do so. Just shoot me an email. So one of the joys of studying literature is to study the context around the book, not just the book. And we've done some of that already with Crane's biography, right? Something that's not in the text, but in the context. And I'm having you read pieces from Charles Loring Brace, Reverend Thomas DeWitt Talmage, Jacob Rees, it's pronounced, and Thomas Gullison. There's more to come, but that's the first part of the readings. Mark Twain, I mentioned him before. He called this period, the 1870s to 1900, our book is the latter part of this Gilded Age, 1890s. Because gilded in this sense means covered in gold, like a thin veneer of gold on the Capitol building in Des Moines or whatever. And he called it that because on the surface of it, it was so amazing. There was all this new wealth. This was the robber baron period. And so these extraordinarily wealthy, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, John Pierpont Morgan, all of them, railroads, oil, so many steel fortunes to be made, and they were made. And yet Twain said, it's got this beautiful thin covering on it, but when you peel that back, it's so corrupt underneath. And indeed, there was just extensive corruption in federal government and within these large businesses themselves. And case in point, the poverty that existed in our city, beautiful New York rising. This is the equivalent in the United States is the rising world power. And yet, beneath that is this underclass of people who are suffering so badly. So Charles Loring Brace, he's still famous. You can look him up. This society still exists. It's a wonderful thing. Primarily began to help orphans in New York because there were just so many street kids who had nothing, and no food, no schooling, no shoes, no parents. And he writes, you just got a couple of pages and you should look closely at his solutions. He was behind the orphan train movement. So late 19th, early 20th century, they put tens of thousands of New York orphans on trains and shipped them out to the Midwest. And families adopted them, Some of these stories are really touching. They went to work on a farm in Nebraska or something, were raised as their own. Others were not so fortunate, and it became more of an abusive situation, like servanthood. But he believed just to get them off the streets and get them out of the city would help. He believed in education, and he believed in marriage. So it was a really a dated idea. It was very patronizing in the sense of the patriarchy, where, especially for young girls, I mean, when you read that piece, it's interesting because he almost says, like, kids like Jimmy, or Pete for that matter, you know, the boys who grew up in these circumstances don't have it that bad. Whereas the young girls are especially affected, and it's classic gender politics, but he meant well. And he did a lot of good. And as I said, the AIDS Society still exists. So DeWitt Talmage was a minister, as you can see, and I think there's a couple of footnotes in the reading about his popularity. And he was incredibly popular, even, you know, much more so than Crane's father. He was a really dynamic minister. And when you read the piece, you can probably understand, if you imagine this sermon being delivered verbally. He's a really dynamic speaker. You know, this was before television and radio. You know, film was in its infancy, and there was very little of that kind of mass media. So these kinds of, you know, you think about the power of a big popular minister. He had a lot of political clout, and he just hits the nail. Well, what is that saying? If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And for him, you know, it's alcohol. That's everything that's wrong with the situation. And you know, having read the Alexi book, right? Problem with alcoholism on the reservations, and the way in which alcohol flowed through the tenements, he's got a point. And eventually this does his view, right? His vision, and many others like him. Women's Christian Temperance Society leads to prohibition, and we try it. We try to go dry as a country because of stories like the ones we hear about Maggie and others. And it's an interesting thing, right? Because if part of Crane's point is to say, you know, look at how the mission churches are failing, or at least look at how how bad these conditions are for the Johnson family. You know, hundreds of thousands like them. What do we do? And he's a fiction writer, and he's practically a kid. You know, he's in his 20s. Whereas these folks, you know, Brace and Tony, these are leading political and social figures. You know, Brace was a big deal. He was a well-known person in New York circles, and as I said, as was Talmage. So, you know, Crane's contribution to this is really minuscule when you think about it that way. At the time, you know, his book has really become something very still readable, I think. Whereas, you know, to read Brace and Talmage is a bit of a snooze, and it's so dated. That's the beauty of fiction writing, I guess. Then there's Jacob Riis, and he too, leading figure social in terms of a social movement. He was an immigrant himself, and he was a journalist, a photojournalist, and that made him interesting because photography was also in its infancy, as you know. And so he would go into the projects. Those didn't exist until the 60s and 70s, but in a way, right, the ghetto, the slum. Project housing was an invention in the 60s to try to help deal with these conditions too. And Riis cared deeply. he was like a guy who counts things, not a creative writer, but a counter, a data guy. And so even in the short, and this is a bit of a longer chunk that you read, you get all these numbers, right? Documentarian who counts things, yeah. And some of the numbers are pretty incredible, as I'm sure you noted. Numbers of churches, numbers of bars, numbers of gallons of whiskey brewed every day, number of children who died. And some of the stories are as ugly, as awful as anything in Crane. I mean, I think especially of that little boy who dies. Wow, you know, he's sort of blackout drunk, but then the rats eat him. I mean, it's just an interesting thing was, it's like, because you might ask yourself, well, these are really gruesome stories. How could this be published and Crane not get his book published? So a couple reasons. One is that Rees was a really well-known writer and journalist. So, you know. Two, it's interesting how the public perceives things back in the day, right, and now too. If it was nonfiction, it was okay. But if it was fiction, then we didn't want to make things up, even though they were as true as any, something that violated some sense of propriety, even though they were as true as anything you could find in a documentarian's book about, you know, what's actually happening. So it's curious. And then a bit about gangs, which were very much a problem. And usually they were along the lines of ethnic conflicts, you know, the Irish, the Italians. And then his chapter on prostitution has a lot in common. And I think there's some story of Crane knowing Rees a little bit anyway. But again, Crane is very young, and Rees is very well-known and experienced, or moved in important social and political circles. And Crane is just a kid. Anyway, there's some evidence that Crane and Rees knew each other, and that Crane knew the book. So that's the context. You see what I'm getting at? This little novel isn't some isolated phenomenon. It's not some magical, you know, work of the creative genius, although it is. It's not separate from its world. A lot of people were talking about these stories and what to do. How the other half, you know, the two halves of the Gilded Age, was super successful, wealthy. But also included that in that is this new middle class too, because all of this, you know, development of all the natural resources, the growth of the cities, the expansion west, and this all gave all these immigrants all these opportunities. Now America was reinventing itself. It survived a civil war. After 30 years later, we're expanding, growing, people flooding in. But even with all that success and opportunity, there's still this underclass that we're not taking care of. All right. Oh, so Gullison is a scholar, and this is more contemporary. He's the person who put this book together, in fact. Think of him as an English professor. And he did some sleuthing around and noticed that in Jonathan Townley, Reverend Crane's, the dad's sermons, there was a lot of material that Crane used. And he notes that he knew Rees and knew the book, knew the work. And also Teddy Roosevelt was part of this. So this is long before TR is president. In fact, it's before he becomes, his first major appointment was police commissioner. So you got to think of young TR, and the Roosevelts are among the most popular, powerful, and influential families of the United States, especially in this period. You have two presidents, numerous political figures, military figures, old New York money. Point here, right, is Crane is this kid who's looking in on this world of power and influence in politics and social movements. And the bigger claim here, which doesn't mean a lot to us, I guess, but there's been a lot of, over the decades, that Emile is a French novelist, because this kind of writing about people the way Crane does, is present in many other writers' work. And for a long time, people just attributed, young Crane was looking to this French novelist and saying, oh, I'm going to give Zola an American setting. And Gullickson says, no, this is coming out of Rees and out of his dad's sermons. So. All right. Our next section of contextual materials are reviews and criticism. And these are what they are. These reviews are what we see today. So a new movie comes out, new book comes out, somebody writes a review. And so all these newspapers and publications reviewed the book, and these are excerpts from those reviews. And then the criticism is somewhat more developed, and this isn't contemporary with Crane. These works of criticism are from across the decades. So let's see, from 60s through the 90s, I suppose, those decades. Okay, so that's where we're headed next. Pause for just a minute. One thing that's clear from the reviews is that not everyone liked the book. It was not universally well received, shall we say. And what I have on these slides is some real specific references here where you can look at the reviews and see exactly where and what they're saying. So paragraph by paragraph. Point Jervis, newspaper that's back in New Jersey. And then Hamlin Garland, Frank Norris, and William Dean Howells are all really famous writers from that time period. And these are the newspapers, the other newspapers. So who liked it, who didn't, and why. You can see that there. And then I just did a little quote. Oops. Oh, come on. My animations don't want to work very well, but anyway, thumbs up for a genius for description and great skill in the analysis of human character. Hamlin Garland said, the dialect of the slums, the crisp, direct, and terse prose style. So that's what we talked about earlier. And Garland really liked that. The bookman said, oh, remember it was the one that it didn't review the book so much as reviewed the content. And kind of made the point that Okay, most publishers would have found this material objectionable about a prostitute, because if she would have like been redeemed or gotten married or, you know, turned from her evil ways and come back into the fold of the middle class society, I think that story, in fact, that I know that story exists all over the 19th century, but because she dies, unforgiven. I mean, her mother does, but in the eyes of the readership, it's a pretty bleak end for a promising young girl. And this reviewer, like, well, like room in heaven for Maggie. Like maybe it wasn't her fault. Maybe maybe Crane's point isn't to say, you know, she got what she deserved. It might be we need to help people like this girl. And what the church is doing, what I was part of, isn't working. So you might ask, you might ask yourself, well, why are we okay with these stories now in fiction? And why were the moral codes and the social acceptability of things, why has that changed? Well, here's one reason, right? Because to say, okay, we're not going to read stories like that, we can't publish, that's not okay. No. If we're going to acknowledge that people's lives are like this, and the ways that the structures we have in place to help them aren't helping them, then we need to hear these stories instead of censor them. The New York Tribune said, thumbs down, there's no charm, no style, no imagination, a story of unrelieved dullness, so they hated it. If you check the paragraph footnote, you'll see that Crane used to work for them, and there was bad blood, so he was a journalist there for a while, so they were out to get him, I guess. The Nation was also down because there's that word realism. They didn't like all his animalistic descriptions. They didn't like the way he wrote about people. They didn't like that he essentially treated people like animals. You know, a dinner scene is like, you know, lions at a carcass of a water buffalo or something, and their behavior is little more than just, you know, one lurching from one lustful or anger-based. It's just base instinctual behavior. He's treating people like animals. And that's not how to write good fiction, because people aren't animals. And they don't live in a jungle, a concrete jungle, an asphalt jungle. And I'm pausing because I want you to think about that. Is it Crane's description, or is that realism? Right? I mean, is Crane the one turning them into animals? So, well, writers have choices, right? You can decide what characteristics to focus on. Well, Rees's pictures, his documentary, his description sounds an awful lot like Crane's fiction. So it sounds like Crane isn't the one turning them into animals. I know it's not pleasant to read, and it certainly wasn't pleasant back then. If the idea is for fiction to be morally uplifting, to be inspirational, to focus on the positive, to provide examples of behavior. And Crane says, well, this is what's happening. This is how things are. Frank Norris says, it's kind of a middling review, sort of thumbs in the middle. What he liked was the flashlight photograph style, which it gets back to that episodic nature of the book that I talked about. There are these little scenes, and it's like, for Norris, it's like, boom, the flash goes off, you see this, and then you move on to some other picture, which I like very much because photography was so new, and that's exactly what Jacob Riis was doing. So I didn't mention it. You should use, just on the internet, just Google Jacob Riis, and all these pictures are going to come up. These amazing photographs of the tenements you can see clearly. And that's what Crane was doing too. But then he says it's too flippant for the serious subject, because I think what he means is, again, this episodic style, because there's no depth, right? There's no reflection, no meditation on what's going on. It's just always the surface level. This fight, and this meal, and this conversation. There's no, the narrator isn't giving us anything. And so for Norris, it's like that, we need we need some help here to interpret this. But Crane's narrator is not going to do it. All right. Well, William Dean Howells, he's by far the most famous of all these writers and publications in terms of literary power, literary politics. He was the editor of a couple of really important journals in New York, and his judgment could make or break your career, that type of thing. And he loved it. He said it's great art about an ugly subject because of, quote, the personalities of the story. And that's a pretty interesting way to look at it. Like, yes, it's ugly, despicable. We don't want to see this. It's how the other half lives. But the personalities, and you think, after reading Jimmy, Pete, Maggie, even Nellie plays such a small role, or the woman downstairs who plays a small, they stick in your mind. He's so good at writing character. And Mary, Mother Mary, wow. What a mother. Opposite. Anyway, so that's a little taste of what the reviews were back in the day. Now, over the years, the book has received a great deal of literary attention. It's taught a lot. It's maintained a kind of currency for some of the reasons we talked about. It spoke truth to power. It's engaging. And once you get past the dialect, as I said. Anyway, all of these are literary critics. One, John Berryman, is a writer himself, well-known poet, actually. And the others are, think of them as like high-powered literature professors who publish lots of books and have interesting things to say. So the first two, we're going to take these together, Walcott and Berryman. They disagree, these two, about the position of the narrator with respect to the characters. Berryman argues that Crane's narrator never offers, quote, one note of sentimentality or reproof, leaving the reader to, quote, draw his own conclusions. On the other hand, Walcott claims that, quote, no reader can feel that Crane is scientifically disinterested or unconcerned. Now, so if we think about that, what do you think? Is Crane's narrative perspective one that places blame on or judges the characters? That's what reproof means. And does Crane's narrator offer excessive tenderness, sadness, or nostalgia? That's what sentimentality means. So that would be Walcott here, right? Or does the narrator remain scientifically detached, dispassionate, or uninvolved, as Perryman suggests? And then recall a passage or a scene that supports your view. And it's an interesting question. Now, Walcott kind of conflates Crane with the narrator, and that's not really fair, because an author is here, right? And then you create a narrator and then you tell the story. And sometimes that narrator has an identity, right? I found this story in a bottle, washed up on the beach, you know, and inside there was a note and it said, you know, to whoever finds this story, you need to tell it. And then there's the story. But in fact, you know, the writer wrote it, obviously. And then there's all sorts of layers. If you're familiar with stories of any kind, ways of layering. It's like, this story was told to me by the lawyer of the guy who was entrusted with the papers of the second cousin of the daughter's roommate, who told her this story and then, you know, died of unexplained, you know, it can get crazy. And all that's happening there is that the real writer, right, out here in the world is putting distance between themselves and the story because they made it up, right? So it's interesting, and it's what gives fiction so much flexibility and interest and makes it I teach nonfiction writing too, so don't get me wrong, competition between what's better, nonfiction or fiction. I teach feature writing, which is a kind of journalism, and I love it, and I write nonfiction, personal essays, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing about fiction is you can get nonfiction inside it. It's harder to get fiction inside nonfiction, if you know what I mean. So you're telling a true story and then you start writing something made up, which would be fun. But it's much more typical and easy, sort of within a made up story, to just do something straight up factual. So writing, right? Literature is just, it's one of the greatest things humans do. Anyway, how narrators are is really important. And there's some disagreement about how Crane relates, you know, to his own story here. All right. Moving on to William Stein. And he says, or his thesis, and this is sort of me summarizing here, might be most concisely stated on page 172. Quote, Maggie, in short, is crucified by the same forces of hate in human nature that's destroyed Christ, end quote. And then look at the evidence that Stein develops to support that view. And it's an interesting read, right? That the innocent girl, and in some ways, I mean, it's not overt. It's not a, you know, a parable or some allegorical one-to-one relationship. It doesn't mean that. It's just, it's like Maggie has some characteristics of being this sort of untouched, untarnished, unaffected blossom in a mud puddle, I think is the line. And then she's killed by that environment. So it becomes a kind of metaphorical retelling of what happens to good people in a bad world. Finally, Donald Pizer, and he's the most distinguished critic among all of these writers. How might he answer our question about who or what is to blame for Maggie's demise? And then I say see pages 190 through 191. And I think what I'm going to do for this is actually pull up the PDF so I can talk about this a little more specifically with you. So I'm going to pause here and grab that PDF a second. Okay, I'm going to pull up the PDF here. So here's Donald Pizer, pages 90 through 91. Let me read this to you. Bottom of page 90. Okay, he's talking here where my cursor is about Mary, about the mother. And he says, in a sense, she, that is Mother Mary, symbolizes the entire Bowery world, both its primitive amorality and its sentimental morality, concepts which he's developed in previous pages. It is appropriate then that it is she who literally drives Maggie into prostitution and eventual death. At which point I'm thinking, okay, I can accept that as an answer. Because just because he's a high-powered literary critic doesn't mean, I'm not handing this to you as either my interpretation or his or reading. That's the joy of literary study, right? We think about these stories. And we don't just disagree for disagreement's sake. We disagree and agree and think in order to help clarify and understand who we are and why we do what we do, and the importance of storytelling, grow in our faith, and the joy of it too. Anyway, I don't know that Mary is responsible. I could just as easily place the blame on the woman downstairs for spreading the rumor. Or Pete. Anyway. Secure in her moral role, she refuses to allow Maggie to return home after her seduction by Pete. And somebody, actually, that's not my handwriting, but I like it. I borrowed this book from somebody. Presumed seduction. I love that, right? Because we do not have evidence of a seduction by Pete. And they date, right? We see the 3 dates at dance halls, and even, well, okay, depending on moral codes and so forth, but even if they did, but you know how the gender politics works of the day, right? Men like Pete and Jimmy obviously run around town, sleep with every one they can, and aren't, called, hauled in by the collar, or, discarded by their society the way women were. Anyway, driving her into remaining with Pete, okay, and then into prostitution. Okay. Maggie is thus destroyed, not so much by the physical reality of some slum life, which an argument could be made about that, right? The tenement house, the lack of decent food or good jobs, the availability of alcohol, all of those characteristics of the slum. You say, well, that's what caused it. And Pfizer's saying, no. What causes it is this: a middle-class morality imposed on the slums by the missions and the melodrama, a morality which allows its users both to judge and to divorce themselves from responsibility from those who judge, which is kind of a complicated sentence, but I think maybe, it'll ring true as one possibility. I'm not presenting this to you as the interpretation of the book, but it's an interesting idea here because it gets at something interesting related to what we know about Crane. So let me just put it in other words, where the Christianity from middle-class New Jersey and its morality comes to the slums via the church, mission churches, the Methodists. And this is another thing Pizer develops, and that has to do with the plays and the shows that they watch, and Maggie thinking about the theater. It's a similar kind of theater, a theater of melodrama where sin is punished and good is rewarded, where in Maggie, good is punished. And so Mary can say, you're gone to the devil, because I'm secure in my moral authority as I parrot what the middle class does. You know, I'm pretending I'm a middle class suburban, housewife who's upstanding. I mean, but it's just laughable. It's just horrifyingly laughable, because Mary is the exact opposite of a decent mother and a moral, upstanding citizen. Anyway, because she can claim the falseness of that narrative, then she can say, hey, Maggie did it herself. She's to blame. I can wash my hands of this. I can judge her secure in my own moral standing, because I have this myth of middle-class morality. But it doesn't fit in the slums. It doesn't work. So it's a pretty powerful indictment of middle-class morality on Crane's part. The other thing, I'm just picking out one quote here. There's more. This is a good essay. It's lengthy, but it's really worth digging into. The other thing that Pizer develops is the power of the neighbors, if you will, which is part and parcel of this middle-class morality. And what it says is morality is determined in the eyes of the neighbors. In other words, and this is simple enough to understand, we base our entire lives on what the neighbors will think. Does that make sense? I mean, that's really what's going on here. It's like, well, why do we base our entire lives on what the neighbors will think of us? Well, because the neighborhood has constructed the idea of right behavior and moral behavior. And in the case of tenement houses in New Jersey, tenement houses in the Bowery in the late 19th century, that morality is constructed on the basis of a complete misunderstanding of Christianity. The Christianity that judges and that does not forgive. The Christianity of the clergyman who meets Maggie on the street, sees that she's a prostitute, and hastily turns away from her. So it's a little book, but it's a pretty powerful one. Okay, let me go back. Okay, back to my slides here. And make that full screen. So that concludes my comments about the criticism. And then the essay question is here, and it has a lot to do with the things we've been talking about. This part, and then this provocative question. I think, and this is part of the discussion question for next week. It'll be helpful to see what your peers dig up, because some of you will read the book, and I mean, it's easy enough to see when the ministers in church are announced, and it's like, that's clear. But what some of you who may have a stronger background, when I say biblical echoes and references here, some of the footnotes tell you when Bible verses are being referenced. But there's just this, Crane was raised by ministers, he's just got the Bible and the language of Christianity just, imbued, and it's just inside him. And so when he writes, it comes out. And it's interesting to note those places where it comes out. So if you do a lot of legwork that way at the front end, gathering that data, which you'll do for the discussion question, it'll make the writing the essay more straightforward. You'll have the data to go on. Okay, and then, you know, as you think about putting the essay together, you might reflect on some of these questions, because in classes where I've had, you know, live discussion, this gets pretty interesting, as you might imagine. I mean, you can take the contrary position and say, wait a minute, maybe Christians, maybe our main purpose isn't to help, I've changed the question. Maybe we're not exactly obligated to help the poor. Where do we get that? You know, isn't our role for something else? And then now I'm back to these other church traditions, right? Our focus should be on the incarnation. Our focus should be on the cross. Our focus should be on theological truth. Our focus should be on maintaining the purity of the community. And the poor, well, maybe. And then the question at the heart of the essay. And here's the evidence that you look for. And then you can put the paper together. So if you're watching this movie, you know, right away, this is a lot, you know, but it's way out there long after you've read all this, and it'll make more sense. So finally, I want to make a final sort of overall comment about how the book fits into its literary context, which I've hinted at before. So a final thought on Maggie, and it has to do with determinism. And this came up a little bit earlier because we were talking about this novelist, Émile Zola from France. And what was happening in artistic, literary, and intellectual circles in the 19th century, earlier, mid-19th century, in France and Britain and Germany and England, was this sort of reflection. It's a philosophical sort of movement, if you will. And it doesn't come to the United States until later, you know, how ideas sometimes move from Europe to the United States. The conversation was about human nature. And the question is, like, what's at the root of it? Are we, this the free will conversation, or determinism, that you may have heard it characterized that way. So are Crane's characters products of their environments, subject to, that is, locked up by their genetics, habitats, and fate? Some critics say so. And then let's unpack habitat and setting and environment, since Crane and Rees too were especially concerned with it. And what's the idea, right? It's one side of the free will debate. It's the side that says, you know, you've got your genetic profile. And back in the day, in the 19th century, they wouldn't have the words about genetics. It was far more rudimentary than that. It was just your, you know, your inherited traits or whatever. And then the environment, so, right? Nature, nurture, right? That question. So it's both, right? But the point here is not to debate whether it's one or the other, nature or nurture, but you're locked in. Those are the two influences on your, you know, human nature and on someone's life, someone's identity, and that's all. Determined. You're determined. You're fated. Now this gets real interesting with Christianity too, right? If you've ever debated predestination and that sort of thing. Well, let's think about it in terms of how the 19th century and these particular writers talked about it. So first, let's think about the ways an environment influences people. There's the physical environment, right? And in these books like Crane's, because there were more writers. It's not just Crane who has it's not some one-off and only Crane did this strange book about these people that sort of looked like they were in a nature documentary in the slums. There were lots of other writers doing this sort of thing. the physical environment is a really powerful thing, especially in an environment like this. I mean, it's easier to see how someone's life could be determined in certain settings, where in other settings where things are sort of free and easy and open, it doesn't have that much influence on you. You could argue that it does, but certainly in the slums it does. So we've got the natural world, the landscape, plants, animals, everything around us. But it's not just nature. It's also the things that we've built. Tenement houses, lack of indoor plumbing, or electricity or not. Clothing we have, the food that's available to us. And of course, the social environment. The codes of morality and behavior, and what people think they should do and be. How important that is in this story, as you can recall. And then religious convictions, what people believe they should be. Spiritual environments, if you will. And finally, or in addition, the economic and political systems that underlie this society. And then a final question, because that's the part of the joy, the interest, the intellectual opportunity here to study literature. We've got this story, and clearly certain parts of the environment here are emphasized above others. See what happens, what's kind of in the background here, is that in 1859, there's a little book published called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. And that, I mean, it wasn't just that book, because Darwin was part of the whole intellectual movement. And this is what I meant by this question becoming so interesting in the middle of the 19th century and eventually the late 19th in the United States. What is human nature? What are we? Where do we come from? Our origins. And to what degree are our inherited traits and environments, the causes of how our lives will turn out. So for fiction writers, France, England, Germany, United States, all of them, wait a minute. If human nature is somehow different than we've ever conceived it to be, then how we write characters should also be different. And so you've got the 20-something who's raised in a conservative Christian home, coming in contact with these new sort of theories about human nature. That's why you get this sort of strange new novel. And it's not unique, and there are lots of writers doing this, and I don't want to go into that. I could start in on a whole long lecture about, it's called naturalism in fiction and determinism in fiction, but I won't I can talk about that at another time if you wish. But it helps account, right? There's this whole sort of thing today is about how do we account for this novel, and why is it so important? And what's its context historically, socially, intellectually? How do we help people given these kinds of forces, knowing what we know about change and transformation and the power of the environment? Anyway, so I'm ending with some pretty big intellectual questions, and they're not so pertinent to what you're going to do. there's a lot of information, of course, about the essay that I've talked about. So I'm going to sign off, and I might make a shorter movie next week to tie up some of these things or if questions arise. So thank you.